Wanderings of Starlight. Before she was the queen of Pixie Hollow, she was a young fairy who had to choose between duty and her heart. It's been centuries since a warm season fairy has crossed into the winter woods, and while most fear the legends of monsters lurking in the frozen lands, Clarion can't help being intrigued by winter's stoic beauty. However, under the watchful eyes of the current monarch and the court's seasonal ministers, Clarion has little time to dwell on daydreams while the days to her coronation dwindle away. That is, until reports of a monster crossing from winter into spring make their way to the palace. Clarion sees defeating this threat as an opportunity to prove she is worthy of her new role. But instead of finding a monster at the edge of winter, she finds Milori, a young guardian of the winter woods. Together, they form an unlikely bond as they race to save their lands. As their alliance warms to something more, they will discover there is a reason a warm season fairy and a winter fairy must not be together, and the cost could be just as deadly as the monsters that prowl the winter woods. For those who see the world as it could be, brighter and full of magic. There are things hidden from all except those who know exactly where to look. If you gaze out your window in the early twilight hours, when all the world is still asleep, you might notice an orb of light flitting through the late summer leaves, each one blushing red in its wake. You might see faint ribbons of gold in the air, shimmering just above the hyacinths, pushing through the newly thawed earth. Perhaps, if you are truly observant, you might appreciate the chisel marks scoring the crystal lacework of each snowflake. Alas, few are, and so few will ever experience true wonder. Few will ever know that even the most mundane thing, the waning of the moon, the flower of the tide, the serendipitous appearance of a lost trinket beneath your kitchen table, is magic. All of it, of course, is the work of never fairies. They orchestrate the turn of the season in a single night, then return home. It is said that if you soar past the second star on the right and go straight on till morning, you will reach it too, the queendom of Pixie Hollow. Considered from above, Pixie Hollow is like a cake sliced into 4 generous pieces. At its heart is the pixie dust tree, luminous and golden as a candle in the darkness. To the east is Spring Valley, where the flowers remain forever in bloom. To the south, the summer glade, where the days stretch long and languid as a drowsing cat. To the west, the autumn forest, cool and crisp and ablaze with color. Then, to the north, are the winter woods. The Dinsians of the warm seasons do their best to keep the winter woods far out of their minds. But when they catch a glimpse of it beneath the vast shadow of the mountain, they cannot help thinking of its skeletal trees, or the icicles glittering like bared fangs in the moonlight, or those who dwell in such a gray and lifeless place. The winter fairies, so the warm fairies reason, are best left to their snowy solitude. They have managed their own affairs for centuries. Besides, the cold there is so bitter and cruel, it will shatter a warm fairy's wings in an instant. No good would ever come of crossing its border. Now, most of the fears are baseless superstition, but unbeknownst to the warm seasons, dark forces do dwell within the winter woods. There is a place where all the trees bend backward, flinching away from the frozen lake sprawled beneath them. There, the very air sits as heavy and wrong as a feverish sweat. No one visits this place, no one sensible anyway, save the young warden of the winter woods. But if you were brave enough, or foolish enough, you could step out onto the ice. Beneath it, you would find not water, but a deep, writhing darkness. Even if you could stomach the dread it inspires for more than a moment, you would not be able to make sense of it. The shadows only occasionally arrange themselves into a recognizable shape. Here a tooth, there an eye, a claw. No, few would ever experience such terror, but if you had somehow wandered down to the lake on this cold, moonless night, as the warden of the winter woods did, you might have seen what he did, the moment a single crack fissured the surface of the ice. You might have heard the splintering that shook the snowfall loose from the branches. You might have felt the very woods tremble with anticipation. Then, something, barely a wisp of a shadow, rose like smoke from the broken ice. It seethed, then coalesced into a form it remembered from the nightmare that birthed it. In the darkness, it was nearly impossible to see, but its footprints fell heavy against the earth. Then, compelled by some horrible ancient instinct, it lumbered towards the warm seasons. Chapter 1. It was the kind of afternoon made for daydreams, the air golden with sunlight and pixie dust, the meadow humming with the low drone of bees. Clarion perched on the branch of an oak tree, surrounded by the sigh and rustle of leaves. How sweet to find herself alone, at least for 15 glorious minutes, with nothing at all to do. She almost regretted the thought, as lovely as it was. It was all too easy to imagine Queen Elvina's response, delivered like a royal decree. The Queen of Pixie Hollow does not sit idle while there is work still to be done. But Clarion was not the Queen of Pixie Hollow. Not yet, anyway, and her weekly appointment with the Minister of Summer had ended unexpectedly early. She did not intend to let this rare glimmer of freedom go to waste. With her coronation looming, her every waking moment was reignited with lessons, rehearsals, fittings, and more meetings than she'd ever thought possible. All essentials, she supposed, when she only had 1 month left to absorb Elvina's hundreds of years of wisdom. And yet, Pixie Hollow was vast and wondrous, and Clarion sometimes suspected she knew nothing about it at all. How could she when she'd spent almost her entire life observing it from afar? Clarion gazed out at Sunflower Meadow with something dangerously close to yearning. As the golden hour drew nearer, the light talent fairies emerged, aglow with excitement and eager to face the controlled chaos of their busiest time of day. Through the canopy, she watched them weave through the pollen-thick air, leaving trails of pixie dust in their wake. Some worked in teams to angle the sun rays ever closer to the horizon line, shouting things like, "A little to the left. No, your other left." Others dipped their hands into beams of sunlight and scooped them into their baskets, as easy as collecting water from a well. It never failed to astound Clarion how many tiny details went into the everyday magic of a sunset. It seemed impossible that soon, on the night of the summer solstice, she would be responsible for all of them. The prospect terrified her more than she cared to admit. A high-pitched buzz sliced through her thoughts. Then something hurled past her, a streak of black against the brightening sky. Clarion stumbled backward, nearly losing herself before steadying herself on a branch. What in the stars was that? With a hand resting against her pounding heart, she peered down through the curtain of leaves. A bee, faltering in her flight, landed heavily on the ground and went terribly still. After a moment, her wings fluttered, and Clarion let out a sigh of relief. Not injured, then, she thought. The poor thing must have exhausted herself. Bees were an industrious bunch and tended to overestimate their limits, especially here in the perpetual heat of midsummer. Luckily, it was nothing a spoonful of sugar wouldn't fix, and there was sugar aplenty in Pixie Hollow. The kitchens, no doubt bursting with all manner of sweets at this hour, were back at the palace. Better yet, the hive and all its honey was just across the meadow. A simple problem with a relatively simple solution. And yet, Clarion hesitated. Any trouble in the queendom made her itch with a desire to fix it. Once, she'd believed that tendency was a spark of her latent governing talent magic. One small piece of the whole that finally made sense to her. But now she understood that her instincts, her compassion, could not be trusted. The Queen of Pixie Hollow does not belong among her subjects. Ever since her arrival, the night she emerged from a fallen star, as all the queens of Pixie Hollow before her had, 𝐒𝐿𝐒 had impressed upon her that she was different, that they were different, marked incredibly with stardust. Besides 𝐒𝐿𝐒, Clarion was the only governing talent in all of Pixie Hollow. Clarion glanced at the meadow where teams of animal talents and garden talents shepherded their flock of bees. Would they notice one missing? Even if they did, a search would take them all night. Perhaps something as menial as saving a bee was beneath her notice, but she could not stomach the thought of leaving now. What kind of queen would she be as she turned away from the suffering of even the smallest of her subjects? Now, there was just the matter of getting down from this tree. A heavy cloak hung round her shoulders, trapping her wings beneath its weight. All fairies emitted a faint aura, one that flared and dimmed with their moods. But thanks to her wings, her glow had always verged on irrepressible. Although the light talent fairies here in summer shared her penchant for gold, the resemblance wasn't striking enough to allow hiding in plain sight. Letting anyone see her wings was as good as shouting, "Here comes the future queen of Pixie Hollow." If anyone told 𝐿𝐿𝐒 she had been here unattended, no, it did not bear thinking about. She would have to climb down. Inconvenient, yes. Dangerous? Almost certainly. But she preferred by far the risk of falling to enduring another of 𝐿𝐿𝐒's lectures. Steeling herself, Clarion lowered herself branch by branch. Her muscles burned and the bark scraped her hands raw, but by some miracle she managed not to roll her ankle as she landed in the sea of sunflowers. They towered above her, swaying gently in the breeze and casting dappled shadows across the grass. And there, just a few yards ahead of her, the bee lay in a pool of yellow sunlight. Warily she approached the bee and knelt beside her. "Are you all right?" The bee's antenna swiveled lethargically toward her, which Clarion chose to interpret as a yes. It occurred to her that she'd never interacted with a bee before. Many fairies kept them as pets, as much as one could keep them, considering they came and went as they pleased. The fairies befriended them with dishes of nectar left on windowsills and home gardens full of their favorite flowers, catmint and lavender and black-eyed Susans. 𝐿𝐿𝐒 had never forbidden such things, of course, but she had not encouraged them either. The ease others had with the animals of Pixie Hollow was yet another thing Clarion had never learned. "Let's get you back in the air," she said. She felt only a little foolish speaking to a bee as if she could understand. Only animal talents could truly communicate with their charges. Still, for good measure, she added, "Please don't sting me." Carefully, she scooped the creature into her arms. The bee offered no resistance, and Clarion could have sworn she saw gratitude in her weary eyes. Her fur was surprisingly soft and gave off the faintest scent, the brightness of lemon and the earthiness of pollen. This close, it struck Clarion for the first time just how similar a bee's wings were to the rest of her subjects. They were as fragile and precious as glass, and marked with an intricate pattern of veins. I lost my spot. Where did it go? Oh, there we go. It made that protective instinct kindle brighter within her. Cradling the bee to her chest, she made her way through the field of sunflowers. Through the canopy overhead, she caught glimpses of fairies flitting by. Motes of pixie dust drifted lazily through the air, along with the sprinkling sound of their laughter. It filled her with happiness and longing, and also a terrible loneliness. All fairies who shared a talent lived together, worked together, and played together. They mingled with others, of course, but there was an innate understanding among those who were made for the same purpose. Sometimes Clarion wondered what it must be like to feel as though you belonged somewhere, to have so many others to turn to who all understood you so completely. They arrived at the edge of the field where a lofty maple cast its long shadow over them. But it was the hollow in its trunk, a knothole a few feet off the ground, filled with precise rows of golden honeycomb, that caught Clarion's eye. The hive. Gently, Clarion set the bee down in the grass. "I'll be right back." She gave an answering flutter of her wings. On some level, perhaps the bee did understand her. Clarion turned to the tree and drew in a steadying breath. She'd already climbed one tree today. What was another? She hoisted herself up, finding footholds in the grooves of bark and the caps of honey mushrooms blooming from the trunk. At last, she climbed onto the lip of the knothole. The soothing drone of the bees reverberated within her chest, and the comforting floral smells of wax and nectar washed over her. Clarion carefully pried loose a cap of wax that sealed the honeycomb. Immediately, honey welled to the surface. In the late afternoon sunlight, it almost seemed to glow. Clarion plucked a leaf from a branch, then used it to gather honey dripping languidly from the comb. The journey back down was perilous with one hand, but she managed not to fall. Hurrying back to her bee, she placed the leaf beside her. "Here you are." Clarion watched anxiously as the bee drank. Slowly, the bee began to stir. First, she stood, cautiously as though testing whether her delicate legs would hold her. Then, clearly emboldened, she took flight. She pirouetted and capered, twirling in circles around Clarion as if to say, "Join me." "I wish I could." Clarion couldn't help grinning. Even if her talent eluded her, perhaps she could do some good. "Mel?" someone called, her voice frayed with panic. "Mel?" The bee perked up at the sound of her name. Clarion looked up to see an animal talent frantically combing through the sunflowers. "Looking for this one?" The fairy's tawny face appeared between the petals, confusion writ plain on her features. She blinked hard at the empty space in front of her. Is someone there?" "Down here." She startled, nearly plummeting from her perch. Clarion winced. It was immediately rare to see a fairy on her feet. Self-consciously, she adjusted the fall of her cloak. Fortunately, the brilliance of the summer sun muted the light her wings shed. What little escaped from the collar only faintly stained her skin, no more obvious than the reflection of a buttercup held beneath her chin. Sweat trickled down her back, sliding between her cramped wings. She really could not wait to be free of this cloak, and the heat, for that matter. When the animal talent recovered her senses, her gaze landed on the bee. "Mel!" Mel careened forward toward the fairy at full speed, veering away at the very last moment. The animal talent did not flinch, as though she was accustomed to such displays. She seemed to be fighting back a smile as Mel dove into a sunflower. "You were supposed to pollinate marigolds today," the fairy groused, but Clarion could tell from the look on her face that she was relieved to have found her. Mel resurfaced covered in pollen. She shook off the excess like a wet dog, then flew off to join the rest of her hive. Even Clarion could tell she was preening. "She seems like a handful," Clarion observed. "Oh, you don't know the half of it." The animal talent shook her head with fond exasperation, then turned to Clarion. "That was a kind thing you did." Clarion found herself caught off guard, and somewhat flustered by the praise. Few fairies ever spoke to her without being addressed first. Elvina exuded a commanding aura that enshrouded Clarion in its protection. It kept her in, yes, but everyone else out. She was woefully out of practice with any sort of small talk. Fighting to keep the formality out of her voice, she said, "Oh, it was no trouble at all." "Even so, thank you." The animal talent's smile was as warm as summer itself. "I'm sure you're plenty busy without chasing down wayward bees." Clarion tentatively smiled back. You're welcome." "Have I seen you around before?" The fairy frowned, searching her face as if trying to place her features. "You look almost like Clarion?" Clarion flinched at the sound of her name and at the familiar voice of the Minister of Summer. Exposed. Dread seized hold of Clarion as she turned to face the minister. Aurelia hovered just behind her with a look of mild surprise. She had deep black skin and eyes as golden as pixie dust. Her hair fell in twists down her shoulders. Today she dressed in a gown of yarrow, the tiered skirt frothed with blossoms arranged in clusters of pink, orange, and white. "What are you still doing here?" she asked. "I thought you'd have returned to the palace by now." I took a brief detour, she replied wanly. To rest? Aurelia brightened at that. She'd been shaped by an eternity of languid summer afternoons and valued peace and quiet above all else. Here in the summer glade, there was always time for a nap or a glass of lemonade. But while they dozed during the brunt of the midday heat, they truly came alive at night. Summer was the only season that never truly slept. If Clarion lingered here long enough, those who lived beneath the light of the moon, firefly talents and star-counting talents, would emerge from their slumber. My brilliant protege, Aurelia cooed. See, you are learning about summer. The praise rang hollow, but Clarion forced cheer into her voice. Thank you, Minister. She smiled indulgently. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to check in on my light talents. With that, she left. Reluctantly, Clarion glanced over at the animal talent who had gone quite pale. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, to put her at ease. But it was too late. She saw the exact moment it dawned on the other fairy. The exact moment her shocked slackened into mortification and something like awe. Clarion could hardly bear it. Princess Clarion, she choked out. I am so sorry. Clarion held up her hands placatingly. There's no need to apologize. But there is. The animal talent bowed her head deeply. Your Highness, please forgive me for my impertinence. If I had known, then she never would have spoken to Clarion at all. What else was there to say? Quietly, she said, You're forgiven. The animal talent bowed her head again. Murmuring a breathless thank you, she rushed off. Back to her work, no doubt, and back to her friends. That familiar ache of loneliness unfurled through her like a collapsing star. For a few precious minutes, Clarion had almost been able to forget who she was. Here, there were no guards following her at a distance, no one snapping to attention as she passed, no conversations dying as she approached, no whispers rippling in her wake. But none of it mattered in the end. Even here, she could not escape what she was. She would have wanted this: respect, deference, impartial distance, but she didn't. More than anything, she wanted the only thing that felt truly impossible: to be known. Elvina would never. Elvina. Oh, stars, if she didn't leave now, she was going to be late. Clarion unclasped the brooch at her throat and dropped the traveling cloak from her shoulders. She gathered it up hastily in her arms and took flight, bursting from the sunflowers in a flurry of golden light and golden petals. A few bees lazily trundled by, swerved off course to avoid her. As she rose higher into the sky, she dragged a wake of pollen behind her. She allowed herself a single moment to glance back, and regretted it immediately. The light talents had apparently finished their work for the afternoon. They'd separated themselves into teams and were volleying a ball of light back and forth over a net. Even from the distance, Clarion could hear their shrieks of laughter and the mingled shouts of triumph and frustration when one team scored a point. The sight of her subjects, so completely and uncomplicatedly happy, should have delighted her. But right now, it was only a painful reminder of her own queenly solitude. As much as she wanted to, she would never truly belong among them. Chapter 2. The pixie dust tree loomed in the distance, stately and lush with its cloud-like canopy. Tiered cascades of pixie dust, as golden and bright as starlight, poured from the heart of its highest branches and pooled in the apex of its trunk. Its limbs curled protectively around the pixie dust well before veering off in elegant arches and whimsical curlicues. Clarion had always thought one looked like an upside-down heart, another like the tail of a curious cat, and just below the well, housed in a hollow of the tree's ancient trunk, was the palace. Windows dotted the bark, each one lit from within. Even from here, Clarion could make out the glow of the light she left on in her bedroom, softly emanating from the glass doors of her balcony. She'd counted on sneaking back in being the hardest part of this little venture, but she had not anticipated the added challenge of her own lateness. Really, she'd been on such a good streak of punctuality. Elvina would be so disappointed to see it broken. If only Clarion had managed to master teleportation, one of the most useful governing talent abilities. 𝐒𝐿ve always made it look so easy, dissolving into a swirl of glittering gold dust, then reappearing across the room. Clarion had once managed to make her left hand disappear before it snapped back into existence with a vengeance. Given her track record with magic, she'd been half convinced that it would vanish forever or that it would wind up halfway across the room without the rest of her attached. She landed in the tangle of branches just outside her balcony and dampened her glow. With any luck, no one would be searching for a flash of gold among the foliage, although she secretly delighted in imagining how her subjects would react to the ever-dignified Princess of Pixie Hollow breaking into her own quarters. Imagining 𝐒𝐿ve's reaction, however, was decidedly less amusing. Mercifully, she had had the foresight to leave the balcony doors unlocked. She carefully eased them open, then slipped back into her room. As soon as she latched the doors behind her, muffled voices filtered in from the hallway. Clarion instantly recognized both Petra and Artemis. Feeling a little under the weather, Petra's voice, Clarion noted with pleasant surprise. It was particularly fraying beneath the strain of lying. Her oldest, her only friend had always been terrible at this sort of thing. It didn't help that even after all these years, Artemis, Clarion's guard, always managed to fluster her. Clarion supposed she appreciated the effort, considering she hadn't asked Petra to cover for her. She hadn't even known to expect her today. What fortunate timing. Clarion crossed the room and paused in front of her vanity, which was cluttered with bottles of fragrances and cosmetics. A quick glance in the mirror confirmed that she had no pollen streaked across her nose or any stray petals tangled in her hair. She looked a little flushed from her flight, but that was nothing that she couldn't explain away. Petra had said she felt ill after all. Clarion was tempted to use the excuse to beg off her lessons, but there was no sense delaying the inevitable. She had made little progress in her magic since 𝐒𝐿ve began training her, and she did not anticipate a breakthrough before the next one. A flicker in the corner of her eye caught her attention. The clouds had shifted, letting a wash of sunlight spill into the room. Beyond the glass of her balcony doors, she was greeted with the familiar sight of the mountains, keeping their grim vigil over the winter woods. In the warmth of the golden hour, the snow cloaking them gleamed a brilliant white. No matter how many times she laid eyes on it, that cold, austere beauty never failed to stun her. As foolish as it was, Clarion yearned to see the mountains up close. She could almost picture standing atop their summit, the wind in her hair, the snow dancing around her, the beauty of Pixie Hollow seen from that great height. How wondrous it would be. 𝐒𝐿ve, of course, had discouraged any line of questioning about the winter woods. Even so, winter did not frighten her as much as she knew it should. From the warm, secluded safety of her bedroom, there was something so peaceful about it, and so terribly lonely, just like her. No one from the warm seasons had visited the winter woods in hundreds of years, not since before 𝐒𝐿ve was born, and who knew exactly how long that was. Governing talent fairies lived long lives. Clarion had never understood 𝐒𝐿ve's lack of curiosity. There was a whole other realm they knew nothing about, filled with fairies no one had ever spoken to. Only the spring and autumn fairies had even seen winter fairies, and only at a distance they crossed the Neversea each turn of the season. They're as cold as their season, the reports had said, and hardly even look our way. Clarion tried to envision them, bleak and monochrome against a slate-colored sky, but those spare details had never satisfied her. She burned with questions she might never have the answers to. What must it be like to live in such a harsh place? What kinds of problems did they have, and what was the warden of the winter woods like? Artemis's voice sounded from the hall. "Out of the way, Tinker." A strangled noise of protest, then the doorknob jiggled menacingly against the lock. "Princess Clarion," Artemis called, "I've come to escort you to Her Majesty's chambers." No avoiding it any longer, then. If she really set her mind to it, or believed Clarion was in genuine danger, Artemis was more than capable of removing her door from its hinges. Clarion flung open the door, coming face to face with Artemis's fist raised to knock. Petra, clearly in the middle of a valiant effort to thwart her, was scrabbling for a grip on her forearm. Artemis snapped to attention immediately. Petra smothered a yelp of surprise. A flush dusted the bridge of her pale, freckled nose. Artemis and Petra never failed to strike her in contrast. Artemis with tall, broad shoulders, Petra with bones as delicate as a hummingbird's. Neither, however, had ever bothered to learn what to do with her hair. Artemis had shorn hers to her chin, and it framed her olive-complexioned face in jagged black strands, as though she'd taken a dull knife to it out of the boredom or necessity. Petra boasted a shock of brilliant red curls. Most of the time, it was piled atop her head and pinned in place with whatever she had lying around her workshop. Today, she'd chosen a nail. The metal glinted softly in the light, a safety hazard as far as Clarion was concerned. "Your Highness," Artemis said when she had recovered, "are you feeling well?" "Your Highness." As many times as Clarion had asked, Artemis never dropped her formality. The scout talent had been Clarion's shadow for as long as she could remember, trailing behind her or standing dutifully at her side on the occasions Clarion made public appearances. But in truth, Clarion knew shockingly little about her, other than her frightening competence and her insistence on punctuality. Neither of them was exactly in the habit of sharing her feelings with the other. "Much better now, thank you." Clarion caught a glimpse of Petra's panic expression over Artemis's shoulder. She would almost certainly be late to her lesson now, but she could not just leave Petra to stew in whatever worst-case scenario she'd envisioned. Summoning her most queenly voice, she added, "Will you give me just a moment? I need to speak with Petra. Alone." Artemis, obviously thinking of the unspeakable horror of arriving even 1 minute late to the appointment, looked agonized. Nevertheless, she said, "Of course, Your Highness." She retreated down the hallway and folded her arms behind her back in parade rest. No doubt she'd be listening in, despite her studiously indifferent expression. All scout talents were incorrigibly nosy, but Clarion supposed that was what made them good at their jobs. Clarion ushered Petra into her bedroom and shut the door behind them. Immediately, Petra latched onto Clarion's arm. In a shrill whisper, she demanded, "Where have you been? I stopped by to say hello, but you didn't answer the door. Then Artemis cornered me out here to ask if I'd seen you, and I had to make something up." "I'm sorry, and thank you, Before she could get another word out, Petra slumped to the floor. Her gown, stitched together from green maple leaves, puddled around her. She let out a long groan and cradled her head in her hands. Clarion almost reminded her about the sharp object skewering her shin, but thought better of it. Clearly, she had bigger concerns at the moment. "I don't know how you can be alone with her every day," said Petra. "She is so intense. Have you ever tried to get in her way when she set her mind on something?" "As a matter of fact, I covered for you as long as I possibly could," Petra continued. "But once she reports what I've done to Lavina, my days here are numbered." "Thank you for covering for me," Clarion managed to interject. "But I'm not sure maybe it's not too late to escape." Once Petra got going, there was not much that could stop her. Every word barreled out of her with increasing urgency. "I've heard some fairies make their living elsewhere, stowing away on pirate ships, or—" Clarion did not know where to begin disentangling that. Instead, she pretended to consider it. "Now that's an idea. I imagine they'd have a lot of work for a tinker on a ship." Petra gawped at her. "You're trying to get rid of me." Clarion couldn't keep herself from smiling. "Mending nets, repairing the hull, fixing the pots and pans." "All right," Petra groused, but there was no venom to it. "I get it." Clarion laughed softly, but quickly sobered at the strangely bittersweet look on Petra's face. Clarion understood perfectly. It had been a few weeks since they'd seen each other, and yet it felt like no time had passed at all. Although they hadn't been born of the same laugh, sometimes Clarion felt as though they were sisters. They'd always shared some innate understanding. Neither of them was exactly what she seemed at first glance. Few fairies took Petra seriously when all they bothered to notice were the fretful things she said. But Clarion had always loved to watch her mind whir like a fantastical machine. In fact, She considered catastrophizing one of Petra's many charms, now that she knew how to snap her out of it. Beneath it all, she was brilliant and funny and loyal, the kind of fairy who never truly let her fears hold her back, no matter how powerful they were. Oh, how she missed her, even when she was right here. Years ago, before 𝐒𝐈𝐒 had barred Clarion from roaming freely, before their duties commandeered all their free time, the two of them had been inseparable. They'd sneak out, or perhaps more accurately, Clarion would drag Petra kicking and screaming from her workshop to explore, with Artemis's long-suffering presence just behind them. Now, Clarion had her training, and Petra had her work. She specialized in intricate metalwork, but there was little she could not fix or make. Over the years, she'd fashioned everything from jewelry to utensils to sculptures, and dreamed bigger still. She had once spent an entire evening explaining her schematics for a prosthetic limb. Naturally, 𝐒𝐈𝐒 had taken a shine to both her art and her ingenuity, and appointed her as the crown's personal tinker. Clarion still remembered how proud Petra had been, how her excitement had made her positively luminous. It filled Clarion up with the purest sort of joy she'd ever known. As much as Clarion longed for those carefree days they used to share, Petra deserved her success. She deserved happiness. Clarion offered Petra her hands. When she took them, Clarion pulled her off the floor and guided her back into the air. "I'll see you as soon as I can." After a moment, she added, "I'll let you know if you need to flee for the life of 𝐒𝐗." Petra moaned piteously, "Fine." Clarion opened her bedroom door. With one last beleaguered sigh, Petra flitted down the hallway. She paused for only a moment to shoot Artemis a lingering look. Artemis, for her part, remained perfectly impassive, but Clarion did not mistake the tension in her shoulders. Honestly, one of these days Clarion would orchestrate some sort of intervention. 10 years of pining was long enough. "I'm ready," she said. Her bedroom doors opened into a vast chamber, a hollow that had formed in the trunk. Wooden walkways and staircases traced the perimeter, spiraling down to a level of solid heartwood. Beneath that was the living heart of the tree, where magic flowed through it like sap, up to the narrowest veins of its leaves and out to its farthest flung roots. Together they made their way up the winding stairs towards 𝐒𝐈𝐒's quarters. The walls had been worn smooth with time and carved by countless carpentering talents' hands. Clarion always found something new to admire when she passed. Here and there an image struck her. An ornate iris, the round eyes of an owl, the bend of the river that cut through Pixie Hollow. In places, the artwork was concealed by swatches of moss and flowering vines, but Clarion could still see pixie dust-infused paint glittering underneath. No one ever scraped the foliage away. The pixie dust tree, the course, should have a hand in its own styling. They stopped in front of the massive set of doors that stood before 𝐒𝐈𝐒's chambers, each one engraved in breathtaking detail with a mirrored half of the pixie dust tree. Artemis pushed them open for her, letting a blade of late afternoon sunlight cut into the walkway. Drawing in a steady breath, Clarion entered and was met by the wall of portraits. Paintings of all the queens that came before her stared back at her, all of them poised and powerful. With centuries between them, each one was done in a radically different style, but all of them had been wrought with a fervent hand. They filled her with quiet awe. It seemed impossible that her portrait would ever hang beside theirs. When she was younger, she had searched them for any resemblance to her. Some shared her fair skin or hooded blue eyes, others her honey brown hair, but all of them had the same wings, luminous and golden and shaped like a monarch butterfly's. Now, she only worried that if she looked too closely, she would find disappointment in their faces. Clarion tore her gaze away from the portraits. At the end of the row was 𝐒𝐈𝐒, her silhouette slashed into the sunlight window. She wore a golden gown with wide ruffled skirts. The fabric shimmered with the pixie dust woven into it. Golden motes trailed from the train of her gown and sparkled on the floor, swirling listlessly through the air. A crown, the one fashioned by Petra, Clarion noted, sat atop her head. It towered high above her, curling back in the shape of a goat's horns. In it, she looked imposing, exactly as a governing talent fairy should be. "You're late," she said wearily. It was not an accusation as much as it was a statement. It had happened before. Both of them knew it would happen again. Clarion did her best not to wilt at her dissatisfaction. "I'm sorry." Elvina turned to face her. Clarion couldn't help noticing how tired the queen looked today. Streaks of gray threaded through her brown hair, and the brightness of her gown washed out the cool undertones of her white skin. Even so, her expression brooked no arguments or groveling. There was something unknowable in her green eyes, the remote and uncompromising look of a fairy who had lived 100 lifetimes. Sometimes it daunted Clarion, this glimpse of her future. "For a good reason, I trust," said Elvina. "Oh, yes, a very good reason." What that reason was, she did not know yet, but surely she could come up with some reasonable explanation for being late if prompted. Elvina made a dismissive sound, as though the particulars did not concern her. Clarion could hardly believe her luck. "Have you been practicing the techniques we discussed?" Clarion nodded. She had been. Of course she had been. She could not say, however, that she'd made much progress in the last few months, a fact that endlessly dismayed her. From the moment a fairy first opened their eyes, they knew exactly what their talent was, their magical affinity, their calling in life, the thing that came to them as easily as breath. Talents, by most fairies' accounts, gave everyone in Pixie Hollow purpose and joy. Clarion very much doubted her own would ever feel so effortless. Elvina had told her that governing talent magic was rooted in emotion, or rather, the absence of it. Only with perfect clarity of mind and complete focus could she find the freedom to manipulate the starlight burning bright within her. But as much as Clarion tried, whether through breath work or exercise or sheer force of will, she could not empty herself of feeling. She could not shake that desperate hunger for connection. "Good," said Elvina. "Let me see." In an instant, Clarion's hands went cold with nerves. No, she could not despair just yet. Perhaps this time it would be different. She extended her hand. Deep within her chest, she felt that infinite wellspring of magic. If she applied enough pressure to it, if she held on with all her strength, she could bend it to her will. Focus, she thought. Control it. For a moment, a golden light bloomed in the center of her palm. It guttled like a candle in the breeze, but tentative hope kindled within her. She felt lightheaded from the effort, but with just a little more. The light spluttered, then died. Clarion huffed out a breath, closing her fingers around the dying ember as if she could keep it. She tried not to let the disappointment show on her face. Across the room, a bright light flared. When Clarion glanced up, Elvina was illuminated by her power. It balanced in her palm like a star in miniature, casting the planes of her face and all the room in stark relief. It gave off such brilliance and heat, Clarion had to resist the urge to raise her arm to shield herself. Unlike light talent fairies, governing talent fairies did not need to manipulate a source of light. Born from fallen stars, they carried wells of starlight within themselves. Their magic could cut through absolute darkness and most anything else in its path. It could be shaped into a shield to protect the queendom. More than anything, it was a symbol, something the citizens of Pixie Hollow could believe in. Elvina clutched her fist and the light extinguished. Clarion. "Here it comes." Clarion schooled her face into neutrality as she braced for her lecture. "Your coronation is 1 month away." Clarion bowed her head. "It is. You still have not mastered the most fundamental skill of our magic." "I haven't," she said with the barest hitch in her voice. The Queen of Pixie Hollow required a mastery of politics, organization, and leadership, but also the magic unique to governing talent fairies. A magic that Clarion had been struggling to perfect since her training officially began. She could not teleport. She could not produce more than a flicker of light. Evidently, she could not even help a single bee without horrifying her subjects. After a brittle moment, 𝐒𝐿𝐒 asked, "Where were you?" What sense was there in hiding it? She sighed in defeat. The summer glade. 𝐿𝐿e's lips thinned. She did not need to speak for Clarion to feel the full weight of her disapproval. The look in her eyes said it is long past time to set aside childish things. Why did you not return here after your meeting? I'd meant to come back on time, truly, but just as I was leaving there was... She cut herself off before she get lost in details 𝐿𝐿e did not want or need. I thought I would offer my assistance to an animal talent. 𝐿𝐿e's surprise was palpable. That is not your business. I am certain that fairy had the affairs very well in hand. But she thanked me, Clarion protested. Perhaps she needed... I understand you feel constrained by our role, but you cannot help every fairy in need, and you certainly cannot befriend them all. A good queen must focus on the task at hand and help at scale. This is a vast queendom. 𝐿𝐿e floated to the window. Here in the highest branches of the pixie dust tree, they could see half of Pixie Hollow stretched before them. All of it is your responsibility. You understand what this means? Of course I do. You are young, 𝐿𝐿e frowned. You have not known conflict. Not real conflict, one that threatens all of the people under your protection. You must be prepared. Until you have mastered the basics, you cannot attempt to solve problems that are far more complicated than they seem at first glance. I am entrusting all that I have to you. Her tone left room for something unspoken. There were so many things she could fill in. I will not see you squander it. I do not feel you can handle it. To be a good queen is to be as cold and remote as the star from which you were born, Clarion finished for her. It was the tenet that grounded 𝐿𝐿e's philosophy of governance, one that had been impressed upon Clarion since the day she arrived. 𝐿𝐿e leveled her with a flat stare. I know it does not come easy to you, but that is the only way you can maintain impartiality, the only way you can make the calculations you need to rule fairly. But if that was truly the only way, why had she arrived like this? When she first emerged from her star, a sense of purpose had smoldered within her. That certainty felt so far away now. Sometimes she suspected she'd gotten worse at magic the closer her coronation loomed. Sometimes, deeper down, she worried that maybe any day a new star would crash to the earth and a new heir would emerge, as perfect as 𝐿𝐿e herself, as perfect as Clarion failed to be. I understand, she murmured. 𝐿𝐿e's stern countenance softened. You are under a great deal of pressure, but it will come to you, Clarion. But when? The thought stung more sharply than she expected. Thank you. Go and get some rest, said 𝐿𝐿e. You're set to run the council meeting tomorrow. Oh, she'd nearly forgotten. Weekly, the seasonal ministers met to discuss the state of affairs within each of their realms. Anything from disputes to requests for resources was brought before 𝐿𝐿e, and starting tomorrow, Clarion supposed before her. Tomorrow, then. Starting tomorrow, she would try to act like the queen Pixie Hollow needed. Chapter 3. The next morning, with 𝐿𝐿e's admonition still ringing in her ears, Clarion prepared for the council meeting, the first she would ever run alone. For good measure, she shuffled one last time through the papers on her writing desk, a collection of briefs from her ministers. Today's agenda was mercifully and surprisingly light. Pixie Hollow was at its most bustling in the weeks leading up to the seasonal turn. With the solstice a month away, late spring hardly constituted a lull. Not to mention there was the matter of her coronation. Her coronation. The very thought of it made her nerves flare with renewed intensity. Soon, Clarion would make the decisions that ensured the queendom functioned as it should and that the seasons changed without a hitch. Not only Pixie Hollow depended on her, but also the mainland and all the humans within it. The pressure would crack her if she dwelled on it too much. Instead, she would put 𝐿𝐿e's advice to work and focus on the task at hand. If she could not manifest a burst of magic, then she would at least run a meeting with unequivocal poise. Today, 𝐒𝐈𝐒 would find no fault in her. She stood, and immediately a shudder passed through her. Clarion turned, half expecting to find someone or something watching her through the glass doors of her balcony. But it was only her weary reflection staring back at her, framed like a portrait by interlocking branches, and beyond it the mountains of the winter woods. The tallest of them rose into curved peaks, reaching toward each other in the shape of a crescent moon. In the early morning light, all the snow was washed pink as a shell. Sometimes she could almost imagine the mountains were staring back at her. All her life she'd been told that winter fairies were not to be trusted. Few stories remained that explained the source of their conflict, but Clarion had seen one or two theatrical performances that touched on the conflict that had driven their worlds apart. She still remembered sitting beside 𝐒𝐈𝐒, breathless, with her hands white-knuckled around the railing of their opera box, as Saga, the most gifted of Pixie Hollow storytellers, wove the tale of Titania, the first queen of Pixie Hollow. As she spoke, images shimmered in a cloud of golden dust behind her. Flashes of icicle spears and quill arrows, the pixie dust tree no more than a sapling bending to the wind. The warden of the winter woods and his cruel serrated crown wreathed by a towering darkness. Privately, Clarion had thought the drama of it terribly romantic. 𝐒𝐈𝐒, meanwhile, had scoffed when one of Titania's trusted advisors died his tragic death. But for all its theatrics, the legend never expounded on the details Clarion craved. It told of only some vague disagreement between the two rulers, and a dark force that had consumed the warden of the winter woods. That, for most citizens of the warm seasons, was enough to discourage any curiosity about their neighbors. Clarion gathered up her notes and unlatched her balcony doors. Cool air washed over her, and the sounds of Pixie Hollow stirring awake filtered down from above. With a flutter of her wings, she leapt onto the balustrades of her balcony, then into the air. She ascended, pushing aside leaves and twigs until she could see the source of the pixie dust well. A cascade of golden dust spilled from a knothole and onto the pink petals of a lily. The overflow dripped onto tiers of pearl oyster mushrooms until at last it emptied into the well, cradled in the spiraled nexus of the tree's limbs. Pixie dust, the lifeblood of their society, was produced deep within the heart of the tree. No one knew exactly how or why, although dustologists had penned dense academic tomes and quibbled over theories for centuries. All Clarion knew for certain was that magic flowed through it, suffusing all of Pixie Hollow with its vast network of roots. If she let herself pause, she could feel it all around her, warm and comforting. It made the very air smell sweet, like honeyed tea, and cinnamon rolls rising in an oven. Its subtle presence never failed to fill her with wonder. This early, everyone had begun lining up for their daily ration of dust, a teacup full and no more. Dustkeeper fairies stood ankle-deep in the shallows of the pixie dust well, dipping their cups into the pool. With efficiency Clarion admired, they poured it over each fairy. Without it, flight would be impossible. A fairy's wings couldn't support their weight unassisted. All the way down the queue, fairies gossiped and laughed. Some carried cups full of dandelion tea, eager for a kick of energy. Others still buzzed with energy from their night shifts. One of the sparrowmen below noticed her half hidden behind a curtain of leaves. She lifted a hand in a sheepish wave. He paled, then looked away, attempting to do something complicated and industrious-looking with the blade of grass in his hands. Clarion tried not to wilt with disappointment. Petra had always said her expression conveyed a certain queenliness, as did her voice. It wasn't as if there was anything she could do about either of those things. "Your Highness." Clarion let out a gasp of surprise. She craned her neck to find Artemis seated on one of the branches just above her. She always managed to hide herself in plain sight, an impressive, if not occasionally terrifying talent. "Good morning," Clarion said a little breathlessly. Her guard wore an expression verging on sympathetic. It was always difficult to tell with Artemis, who had mastered the subtle art of stoicism. But sometimes Clarion caught Artemis watching the other scout talents when they went out on patrol with something like yearning in her eyes. On the one occasion Clarion had asked her about it, Artemis had shuddered completely. Some wounds, Clarion supposed, should not be picked at. "They're unaccustomed to a queen who welcomes familiarity," Artemis said gruffly. "It's only respect they're offering you." Respect, was it? Even if she wanted it, she hardly felt worthy of it. Still, Artemis's halting attempts to comfort her never failed to bring at least some cheer. Artemis would never admit it, of course, but Clarion suspected there was a sensitive soul buried somewhere beneath that cool, professional exterior. One of these days, she might just reveal it. "Of course." With forced brightness, Clarion asked, "Shall we go?" Artemis nodded. Doing her best to stay out of sight, Clarion led them to the council chambers, located just below the pixie dust well. There was no door to speak of, rather the sides of the domed ceiling had been carved so that it seemed to be paned with swatches of open sky. Intricately scrolled designs, rendered in glittering pixie dust paint, filled the thin strips of bark left between each pane. Hidden within the patterns were the symbols of each season: the evergreen flower for spring, the full moon for autumn, a rainbow for summer, and a snowflake for winter. It had always intrigued Clarion. If their realms had always been separate from one another, why had the art talents included winter in their designs? As they drew nearer, the muffled sounds of the ministers bickering among themselves reached Clarion through the open ceiling. What there was to argue about this early in the morning was beyond her. She supposed it came with such infinitely long working relationships. There was an endless number of petty squabbles and political sites to dredge up and litigate, the origins of which Clarion had vaguely pieced together since her arrival. At any rate, they never tired of debating which of the seasons mattered most. She steeled herself as she entered the chamber. Inside, the 3 seasonal ministers gathered around a long table that took up almost the entirety of the room. The minister of spring seemed to be delivering some sort of impassioned speech, which the minister of autumn vacantly nodded along to. The minister of summer, meanwhile, looked on the verge of falling asleep where she stood. But as soon as they noticed her, a hush fell over them. It was a part of governing talent magic, she'd learned, an ability to command a crowd's attention. Artemis folded herself into the shadows, falling into a perfect parade rest. Clarion kept her chin high as she made her way to the head of the table where 𝐒𝐈𝐒 usually stood. Somehow, the room looked entirely different from this vantage point. Closest to her was the minister of autumn, Rowan, who flashed her an easy smile. As always, he looked as though he'd just stepped out of the cold. His pale cheeks were stung red. His brown eyes twinkled at her, and auburn hair curled around his ears. He wore a patchwork cloak of autumn leaves, fastened with a polished chestnut brooch. Clarion liked him best, if only because he dared to speak out of turn in her presence. He was keen, agreeable, and only occasionally prone to bouts of melancholy. Beside him was the minister of summer, Aurelia, who lifted her chin in acknowledgement. Today she had dressed in the full bloom of her season, a gown of hydrangeas, a necklace of zinnias, and bracelets of roses. She'd arranged her hair in an elaborate bun atop her head. And then there was the minister of spring, Iris, who offered Clarion a small wave of her fingers. She'd chosen a wide-skirted snowdrop gown, and delicate new growth was woven into a crown around her temples, framing her face in long tendrils. She had a warm, sandy complexion and eyes almost as black as her hair. Like her season, she was light and airy, flighty and eager, a personality bright enough to rouse nature from its slumber. This had been 𝐒𝐈𝐒's retinue for as long as Clarion had been alive. Still, she couldn't help feeling that they were incomplete with no minister of winter. Somewhere across the border, the warden of the winter woods ruled in solitude over their frozen realm. But even if the warm seasons in winter had been on good terms, it wasn't as if the warden of the winter woods could join their meetings. Warm fairies could not withstand the cold of winter. After only a few minutes, their wings would turn brittle and shatter. Winter Fairy's wings, meanwhile, would melt like frost beneath the springtime sun. Iris smiled radiantly at her. "Good morning, Your Highness." Clarion startled. The cheer she could muster, even at the earliest of hours, never failed to strike her. "Good morning." "I hear you're leading us today," said Rowan, dropping his voice conspiratorially low. "Finally convinced Her Majesty to slow down for a change, Clarion spread her notes out on the table in front of her. "It's nothing like—" Before she could finish her sentence, the doors opened to admit Elvina. She whisked into the room in a whirl of pixie dust and diaphanous skirts. The ministers immediately snapped to attention, all of them murmuring "Your Majesty" in unison. Elvina, however, did not pause for pleasantries. She said nothing as she took her place at the opposite end of the table. Then she pinned Clarion with an expectant look. "Straight to business, then." "I hereby call this meeting to order." Clarion cleared her throat when her voice wavered just barely. "We'll begin with reports from the ministers. Minister of Summer, will you please share any new business?" "We are nearly ready for the seasonal turn," 𝐒𝐿 said languidly. "I have little to report on apart from your coronation." Elvina said nothing, but she looked visibly discomfited. Clarion did her best to put it out of her mind. The alternative was giving weight to that quiet fear within her that Elvina did not trust her to assume her role. "Preparations are proceeding on schedule," 𝐒𝐿 continued. "We have gathered nearly all the sunlight we'll need, and we've identified the perfect location. When you have a free moment, Your Highness, I'll ask that you come by to approve it." In her warm, drawling cadence, 𝐒𝐿 outlined the other projects her fairies had been working on over the past week. By the time she finished, Iris was practically vibrating with barely restrained excitement. "We'll continue with the Minister of Spring's—" "I am so glad you asked, Your Highness. My garden talents are hard at work on the floral arrangements, but there are just a few tiny things I want to nail down." Iris procured no fewer than 5 bouquets from beneath the table. Rowan looked on in silent wonderment as she placed them in a neat row. "Talk to me about colors. What do you think of these? We could also go in a completely different direction and—" Clarion felt only a little overwhelmed. "I trust you, Minister. I'm sure it's going to be beautiful." "It certainly will be," Iris preened. "Oh, but that still leaves the matter of the dewdrop mosaics. The water talents have been experimenting with designs. Of course, I can't bring them here, but perhaps soon you could come by Springtime Square and we can go over all the details." "I look forward to it," Clarion said, and she found she meant it. Even if she did not have the eye for design that Iris did, her enthusiasm was admittedly infectious. "Minister of Autumn?" "I," Rowan said ruefully, "have nothing to contribute at the moment, at least not to your coronation." It was understandable. Although Autumn wouldn't arrive on the mainland for months, preparing for the seasonal change took a great deal of coordination and effort. Before she could say so, Iris huffed out a sigh. "Oh, but you do," said Iris. "I need to borrow some of your fast flyers." "Ah, right." Rowan tipped his chin. A teasing edge crept into his tone. "Now, why was that again?" "To carry the petals for— Iris threw up her hands. "Listen, if you can't appreciate my artistic vision—" "While we're on the subject," 𝐒𝐿 interjected, "I could use some tinkers if you haven't put them all to work yet." "A more practical concern," Rowan mused, "but I'm not convinced I can spare them." As the three of them wandered down the back roads of their tangent, Elvina fixed Clarion with another speaking look from across the table. This one said, "Well?" Right, it was up to her to bring the meeting to order. "If I may," Clarion cut in, softer than she intended. Even so, they fell quiet. Every gaze in the room landed on her again. Determined not to lose her nerve, she continued, "Surely we can arrange a schedule that works for everyone. Perhaps the Minister of Autumn can spare some fairies for 1 day a week?" Rowan glanced at Elvina as if seeking her approval. Elvina only gave a vague wave of her hand as if to say, "As she wishes." Satisfied, Rowan nodded. Clarion couldn't bite back a smile. Perhaps she had managed one small victory, a resolution for a problem that had been brought before her. Before she could continue the meeting, however, a scout talent all but tumbled into the room from above. All 5 of them jumped with surprise. The scout only narrowly avoided crashing into the table. Nevertheless, she saluted Alvina even as she struggled to even out her breathing. It was as if something had chased her all the way here. Clarion chanced to look back at Artemis. Curiosity and concern warred in her expression, but she did not break from her station. Alvina stood once again, assuming her role as queen. "What is it?" "Apologies for the interruption, Your Majesty," the scout talent wheezed, "but just before dawn, a monster was sighted in Pixie Hollow." A chilly silence descended over them. Iris spoke first, her confusion evident in her voice. "A monster? Like a hawk or—" "No, Minister," the scout replied gravely. "A monster. I don't know what else to call it. It crossed into spring from winter." "A monster? From winter?" Clarion hadn't known anything besides winter fairies, and a few animals thrived there, much less monsters. But when she glanced at Alvina, the queen did not look rattled at all. Then again, she kept her composure in every situation, no matter how dangerous. As much as it baffled Clarion, she had always admired and envied that about Alvina. A true queen of Pixie Hollow could show no cracks. "And what," Rowan asked warily, "did this monster look like?" "It's hard to place, sir. Something like a fox, but not like any fox I've ever seen. It had something like a glow or a shadow." The scout trailed off, growing paler. "We followed it as long as we could, but we lost sight of it when the sun rose." "Send for the commander at once," Alvina said. "I will see her here." With the grounding comfort of following an order, the scout regained some of her composure. She snapped back to attention. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Once you've done that, take your unit and ensure every citizen get inside," Alvina continued. A troubled frown creased her brow. "Until we can identify the threat, no one goes out." "Yes, Your Majesty." Artemis perked up, her fingers twitching towards the sword strapped to her hip. "Your Majesty, if there's anything I can—" "You will not desert your post at the princess's side," Alvina replied icily. Clarion felt a pang of sympathy at how Artemis wilted. Bowing her head, she said, "Of course not." Alvina flicked her wrist at the other scout. "You are dismissed. As for the rest of you, this meeting is adjourned. As a matter of safety, do not leave the palace until you hear otherwise." "But, Your Majesty, I can't stay here," Iris protested. "If it came in through spring—" The look on Alvina's face booked no argument. "The scouts will handle this." "Yes, of course," Iris replied, but Clarion did not mistake the worry in her tone. Aruli rested a steadying hand on her shoulder and squeezed. The rustling of paper and low murmurs filled the room. Clarion watched the ministers filter out, with cold dread lodged deep in her chest. A monster? How could such a thing be possible? "You too, Clarion," said Alvina wearily. "Go to your room." Indignation flared within her. Was that it, then? Dismissed, just like the others, as though she were nothing more than a child? This meeting, an opportunity to demonstrate her capability, had gone awry, and now Alvina would shut her out of something so important? "I can help." "You cannot. This isn't a matter that concerns you." It should have gutted her to have confirmation of all her worst fears. Alvina did not need her. Instead, that seed of anger flared into full bloom within her. She flitted across the room in a rush, her glow intensifying and casting an amber light on the walls around them. "How can it not concern me? I am expected to govern all of Pixie Hollow within a month's time." At last, Alvina looked at her. Truly looked at her. Clearly, Clarion had shocked her because she did not reply for a long few moments. "I only mean to say that you shouldn't worry yourself with this." Clarion could not accept that. "But shouldn't I learn how to handle a crisis?" "There's still time to teach you. That time is not during a crisis. Trust me. I have this in hand." Alvina rested her hands on Clarion's shoulders. They weighed heavily on her, and Clarion found her resistance momentarily smothered beneath her shock. Alvina so rarely touched her, so rarely displayed any sort of tenderness toward her. And yet Clarion could not forget the way Alvina had looked at her when she first arose from the star on her arrival day. She'd helped Clarion out of the crater, then cradled her face with something like wonder and terrible recognition shining in her eyes. It had filled Clarion with such a sadness, one she did not and could not understand. Before she could reply, in flew the captain of the scouts, Nightshade. She was dressed in full regalia, a breastplate and plates of bark armor strapped to her forearms and shins, all of it gleaming menacingly, and carried a spear in her hand and a quiver of sawgrass arrows across her back. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe bun at the nape of her neck, which was bronzed from sun exposure. "Your Majesty, Your Highness," she clasped a fist over her heart in salute. "We should discuss logistics." "We should," 𝐒𝐿vina agreed. "Clarion?" "Please let me stay," Clarion pressed. "I won't interrupt." "It is out of the question," 𝐿𝐿vina snapped. "Go." Clarion could only stare at her, stunned. 𝐿𝐿vina had been impatient or disappointed in her before, yes, but never had she been so curt. Without another word, she turned toward Nightshade and began to speak with her in low tones. Clarion, bristling all over with affronted humiliation, understood that she was indeed the end of the discussion. 𝐿𝐿vina had promised to teach her everything she needed to know, and what better way to learn than by observing? Clearly, her insight was not valuable or welcome. She had half a mind to listen in at the door like a child sent off to bed. She had sworn to do better, to comport herself with the dignity befitting her role, and yet— "Come on, Your Highness," Artemis said quietly. Now there was no mistaking the pity in her voice. She all but steered Clarion out of the council chamber and back to her room. This time, Clarion felt too raw to protest. Outside her bedroom window, controlled chaos had erupted in Pixie Hollow. Distantly, she could hear the sound of the horns echoing from the watchtowers high in the pines. Pixie dust streaked the sky as fairies flitted home, and scouts soared above the canopy, with their bows drawn and their eyes trained on the shadows. Clarion's heart ached with worry. Her people were suffering. Petra was likely terrified out of her mind, and that pained her most of all. "You have to help at scale," 𝐿𝐿vina had told her. But she couldn't, not while she was locked away in her bedroom, and certainly not while 𝐿𝐿vina was barring her from duty. The Queen of Pixie Hollow does not sit idle while there is still work to be done. Clarion had never been perfect, she knew. But how could she ever be when 𝐿𝐿vina's mandates contradicted each other? She would have to choose one, and right now, with her coronation looming so close, she could not content herself with doing nothing at all. It couldn't hurt to look for the monster herself, could it? If she came back with something useful, she would never be shut out again. And maybe, just maybe, she could convince herself that the stars hadn't made a horrible mistake. Surely with all the scouts and 𝐿𝐿vina occupied, no one would notice her missing. She'd just have to wait until nighttime when Artemis was finally off duty to make her escape. As the hours wore on, the sun sank lower, staining the sky a wildfire red. Just before twilight descended, Clarion eased open her balcony doors. When she stepped outside, shadows settled heavily over her and prickled her skin with unease. A gust of wind set all the branches clattering, and buried somewhere beneath the sound, she could have sworn she heard the distant scream of a fox. Somewhere out there, a monster lurked. The thought had no sooner slithered through her mind than her gaze fell on the mountains. The near dark of dusk had transformed into something stark and shadowed. For the first time, they leered back at her almost expectantly. Clarion could not tell if it thrilled or unsettled her more. Gathering her nerve, she took flight toward Spring Valley, to the border where spring met winter.